Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. We're doing Numbers chapter 22 today, and I've struggled really to give it a title. It's one of the few passages in the book of Numbers that I've heard people preach on. Thinking back to what they said, I've never really got a handle on what's really going on here. Well, perhaps until today. I did initially think of calling today's episode, Can God Get Angry with You? But no, that's not really the whole story here. And I think, well, for the title, it'll probably appear it's just going to be Balaam's donkey. But anyway, I suppose there is the element of God chastising and getting angry here with Balaam and intervening as well. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think the point to make is that in the big picture, you can't progress your way through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. I know we're doing alternate books, but when you go through the opening books, you will note that God on certain occasions gets angry with his children. And in fact, you might say that sort of thing appears over and over again in the Old Testament. So the question, I suppose, is if God can get angry with us, what happens when he gets angry? Now, we've been going through the book of Numbers recently together, and we've seen several cases where the Lord got angry, haven't we? And we've seen the consequences of that anger. We even on occasion saw people get physically sick, or a plague hit the nation, and we saw people prematurely die who would have not have died that soon. So it's very clear that when God gets angry, particularly in the Old Testament, there can be really dire consequences. But they're usually framed within people reaping the repercussions of being left to their own desires. So today we arrive at this chapter in Numbers chapter 22, and it has to be said it has one of the most unusual stories, certainly in all of the Pentateuch, because it shows God getting, angry with this fella, Balaam, and the consequences in this case, how can I say it? They're very surprising. It's different from anything we will have seen or experienced in the Bible so far. So today we're going to turn together to Numbers chapter 22 and look at the story of Balaam. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, here we go. What can I make of all this? Well, the opening verses 1 to 5 roughly, are a sort of introduction to what's coming in the whole chapter. But before we look at it, let me just remind you that the children of Israel have now been wandering in the wilderness for nearly 40 years, and they've come back to Kadesh Barnea, and they've tried to go through the east side of Edom, and they're trying to go through Edom, but the Edomites won't let them do that, so they've skirted that area, and they've come to a place which is opposite the city of Jericho on the other side of the Jordan River, and now they're camped there, near but not in the land of Moab. Okay, let me read those opening verses for you, which frames what's coming. Then the Israelites travelled to the plain of Moab and camped across the Jordan from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Ammonites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass in the field." So Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor, near the Euphrates River, in his native land. Okay, so in these opening verses, we've seen this guy, the king of Moab, Balak, feeling scared, terrified in fact, because of course he's witnessed the Israelites' victories over powerful armies and nations like the Amorites. That's happened already. And the Amorites were a group that had previously beaten Moab. So how's he going to feel about the Israelites coming in that knowledge? Now, despite being told by the Lord not to fear, Balak is gripped by dread. And the reason for his fear becomes clear when we understand that the Israelites and the Moabites shared certain kinship ties. And the Lord had instructed Israel not to harm them because they were kin, which also reflects the fact that God in himself had spoken to Balak. Anyway, Balak, still driven by fear, leads to seek out this man called Balaam, whom he hopes will put a curse on the Israelites. But here's the interesting part. Balaam seems to know the Lord. But although he seems to know the Lord, he's still drawn by the promise of the reward that Balak is offering. And this sets the stage for a conflict in Balaam's mind between obeying God's command and pursuing this offer of personal gain. So what can we learn from that, eh? Well, I think the first thing is that fear can distort our perceptions, leading us to sometimes act irrationally. But secondly, surely this is also teaching that the pursuit of money can be something that can lead someone astray from God's will, even if we know him. And Balak's story serves as the cautionary side of the tale against letting fear and dictate our decisions, and Balaam's response illustrates the same, but in terms of greed driving our decision making. But what else can Balaam teach us? Picking up halfway through verse 5. Balak said, "A people have come out of Egypt, they cover the face of the land, and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps I will be able to defeat them, and then drive them out of the land. For I know whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." So Balak's actions are quite fascinating here. Despite being near the promised lands, he sends messengers all the way to Balaam, based by the Euphrates River, seeking his help to curse the Israelites. Balak believes that if Balaam curses them, he will gain an advantage over them. So he's seeking to gain an advantage by which he can conquer the army of Israel. Now, Balaam seems to have a reputation, doesn't he? Those around seem to believe he has ability to bless or to curse people. Certainly Balak's request would strongly suggest that. Now, the identity and the motivation and personality of Balaam is a matter of great debate by many. Some argue that he was simply a pagan, an idol-worshipping false prophet, and they approach this story solely from that perspective. Others, it has to be said, including the very well-known Jewish historian Josephus, believe in fact he was indeed a genuine prophet of the Lord. Now, the Old Testament himself refers to him in other places as a diviner, and that's a practice we know that was forbidden by God in the nation of Israel. However, Balaam's sympathetic attitude towards the Israelites and the fact that he calls the Lord, refers to him as my God in the following verses, suggests that he might have been a believer at some level, but one who was still certainly engaged in pagan practices. So what's the conclusion? Well, I have to say, I'm not prepared to really definitively reach one, even though I'm sure many of you would like it. It's really challenging to determine Balaam's true nature definitively. He presents a complex figure, one who seems to have a knowledge of the Lord, but one who also participates in practices frowned by God. So certainly his practice and his motivations, as will be revealed later, fall far short of what one would expect of a follower of God. And this ambiguity is further complicated by references we find to him in the New Testament, which I'll come to later, but generally they seem to portray him in negative terms. Nevertheless, at this point, Balaam's summons to curse Israel will set the stage for the events that will unfold in the subsequent verses of the chapter. So I'll pick up the narrative again in verse 7. The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said. "Spend the night here," Balaam said to them, "and I will report back to you the answer that the Lord has given me." So the Moabite officials stayed with him. And God came to Balaam and asked, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, "Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. A people have come out of Egypt, and they're covering the face of the land. Now come and put a curse on them for me. Perhaps then I will be able to fight them and drive them away. But God said to Balaam, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on these people, because they are blessed. The next morning Balaam got up and said to Balak's officials, go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the Moabite officials returned to Balak and said, Balaam has refused to come with us. So that's the first major movement, if you like, of this chapter, if we were treating it as a symphony. We see Balaam's response here. Having received the initial invitation from Balak's messengers, Balaam's response, particularly in verse 8, when he mentions asking the Lord for guidance in this, is significant. In some translations, you'll notice that the Lord is spelt with capital letters, indicating that this represents he is using the personal name of God. Some would say Yahweh today. So this suggests that Balaam is in fact communicating with the true God of Israel at this time. He's not using false gods or idols of divination at this point. And when we see Balaam genuinely seek guidance from the Lord, he receives a very clear message, a very clear answer. He's told, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on these people, because they are blessed by God himself, in fact. So this is a pretty straightforward command from God, instructing Balaam not to go with the messengers and not to curse the Israelites, because they are in fact God's chosen and blessed people. And remarkably, initially Balaam obeys this directive, and he sends this first set of guys back to Balak, informing them that he cannot come because the Lord has forbidden it. So this initial response from Balaam highlights his obedience at this point to the instructions given to him by God, the true God, indicating perhaps there is a certain degree of genuine faith and devotion mixed in with all the false occultic stuff that's going on in his life as well. Anyway, verse 15 continues the story. Then Balak sent other officials, more numerous and more distinguished than the first. And they came to Balaam and said, this is what Balak, son of Zippor, says. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Come and put a curse on these people for me. So this is the second part of the passage, the second movement, if you like. We've had the introduction, we've had the first invitation, now it's the second invitation to come. Only this time he's sending not only more representatives, but more important, more distinguished people. So Balak was undaunted. He didn't pay attention to what the first lot of ambassadors says and the rejection that they brought, but he just responds by sending more of them a second time, and more important ones than the first lot he sends. And notice what he says to them as they're leaving. Don't let anything stop you from this man coming, because I say, make sure you tell him I'll honor him greatly. So he's telling Balaam to come because that's where the money is. Will Balaam follow the money? He's being promised a handsome reward, a handsome payout. And then on top of that, he says, I'll also do whatever you tell me to do. You could say he's almost saying, name your price. Just come and curse these people. So he's trying to sweeten the deal in every way he can. But Balaam, okay, picking up the text again, verse 18, but Balaam answered them, even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in the palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Now spend the night here so that I can find out what else the Lord will tell me. So that night God came to Balaam and said, since these men have come to summon you, go with them then, but only do what I tell you. Okay. So Balaam's interaction here with God in verse 18, it's intriguing to me. On the surface, it seems like he firmly refused in any way to go or to offer a curse on Israel, declaring, even saying that if Balak were to give him a house full of gold and silver, he wouldn't go. But I sense the man protests too much. If you consider the context and Balaam's subsequent actions, it appears that there's more going on here than the flat narrative response meets and how that meets the eye. You see, in verse 19, Balaam still asks these guys to spend the night. He didn't have to do that. And he says he's doing that so he can inquire further of the Lord. Now, I think this suggests to me, and I've read a number of commentaries that say the same thing, but pretty much every commentary you read takes a different perspective on that. Anyway, the one that resonates with me is that I think he was hoping for a different answer from God this time, perhaps one that would allow him to go and receive the personal rewards to go with these guys, but maybe perhaps at this point still deliver the message of God. The key thing for many people approaching this passage is, at this point, for most people, major doubts are raised about the sincerity of his declarations in the previous verses. So now in verse 20, God does appear and does indeed speak to Balaam, and he permits him to go with these men, but under the condition that he only speaks the words that God has told him to say. So while God allows Balaam to go, it's clear that that was not God's preferred course of action. But he says if you're going, he warns him to only speak what he tells him to say, emphasizing that God will still indeed and intends to bless Israel. So while Balaam may have initially refused to curse Israel, his subsequent actions and God's response still that he is being tempted by the offer of wealth from Balak, and who knows how that might play out when the money's dangled in front of him or presented on the table in front of him. Now, the ambiguity of Balaam's motives here and God's response, I think on one level makes it difficult, but I also think it adds real depth and nuance to this narrative, because it raises questions about God's character and faithfulness to God's commands and how they work out in the battles of our minds and mixed motivations. And they are debated, it would seem to me, by theologians to this day based on this chapter. Anyway, let's continue with the story and see what can I say? It's all going to get a little bit weird. Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose them. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road, with a drawn sword in its hand, it turned off the road into a field, and Balaam beat it to get it back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards, with walls on both sides. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. Now when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry, and he beat it with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." So this is a really surprising turn of events, isn't it? God has allowed Balaam to proceed with his journey, despite initially saying he couldn't do that. However, God's anger is kindled against Balaam. So there's a suggestion here that he knows that Balaam is musing on the situation on the journey, and in fact that he's going to be disobedient. So he sends this angel of the Lord to intervene. Now, the angel of the Lord is a complex term. I'm not going to go into it now. I suggest you look back in the book of Genesis at Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord, where I give you a full explanation of what I believe it means most of the time when we see this reference. But what I've said already, to sum it up in a phrase, when we see this word appear in the Old Testament, it is very often referring to what I believe is the pre-incarnate Christ. Anyway, here we have Balaam riding on his donkey, and did you notice it's the animal that senses the presence of the angel of the Lord, not Balaam, and not surprisingly, this animal veers off the path. Now Balaam, likely, I believe, unaware at this point of this celestial presence of the angel of the Lord at all, just simply frustrated by this disobedient donkey. So he strikes it. And this happens repeatedly as the angel continues to obstruct the path in various ways. But here's where it gets a bit bizarre. The donkey speaks to Balaam, questioning why he's being mistreated. Let's hear what it says. The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden? To this day, have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" "No," he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing on the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed down low and fell face down. And the angel of the Lord asked him, "Why have you beaten this donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you, because your path is of a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me 3 times, and if it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are displeased, I will go back." So finally, the Lord has opened Balaam's eyes, or at last he's responded in free will, and his eyes have become opened. Anyway, he's seen the angel of the Lord with the drawn sword, and he's pretty much overwhelmed by this divine presence. And Balaam, well, we see him fall to the ground in reverence, and the angel confronts Balaam, rebukes him for his disobedience, his twisted ways, his mixed motives on this journey. But I think what the passage really illustrates for me is you can't miss the fact that this stubborn donkey can recognize God's presence more readily than supposedly this great prophet, because this supposed great prophet is blinded by his own desires and disobedience. I think this is a powerful reminder of the consequences of straying from God's path and the importance of humility and obedience in our walk with him, and beware of what our true motivations are. So the closing passage is, "The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, 'Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you.' So Balaam went with Balak's officials, and when Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the Moabite town on the Arnon border at the edge of his territory. Balak said to Balaam, 'Did I not send you an urgent summons? Why didn't you come to me? I am really not able to reward you.' 'Well, I have come to you now,' Balaam replied, 'but I can say whatever I please. I must speak only what God has put in my mouth.' Then Balaam went with Balak to Kiriath Huzoth, and Balak sacrificed cattle and sheep and gave them to Balaam and his officials who were with him. And the next morning Balak took Balaam up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he could see the outskirts of the camp." Okay, the close of this chapter. Well, what we're witnessing here is a complex interplay between Balaam, Balak, and perhaps even God himself. Balaam, very likely a pagan, seems to have some knowledge of the Lord, and on occasion he seeks divine guidance. However, his desires and motives are never entirely pure. He attempts, in a sense, to negotiate with God, but eventually, after flip and flopping, I think in the close of the passage, he's been seen to succumb to his own desires, because the chapter concludes with Balaam meeting Balak and participating in sacrificial rituals, possibly as a means of divination, some of the Bible experts say. So this closing shift towards pagan practices again highlights Balaam's continuing switching of allegiances, and it underscores for all of us the danger of compromising one's faith, and of course the means by which it done here is the offer of personal gain. So overall, this entire unusual chapter is meant to serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of pursuing one's own desires over obedience to God's will. And I think it reminds us of the importance of humility, obedience, and genuine faith in our relationship with the divine. This chapter in Numbers especially when viewed alongside its New Testament references in places like 2 Peter, offers several lessons for us and helps us understand it overall from a New Covenant perspective. Let me just read you 2 Peter 2:15. It says, "They have left the straight way and wandered off." So Peter's talking about people who have walked away from Christianity, and he says they've left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness, but who was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, an animal without speech, who spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Well, he did for a while anyway. So I think the major takeaway here in this Numbers passage is the concept of God permitting but not approving our actions. Despite warning Balaam not to go, putting obstacles in his path, God ultimately allowed him to proceed, and due, as we discover at the end of it, to his falsely presented motives, turned to paganism at the end, illustrating the principle that if we persist in our own way, God may very well indeed permit it. Even though it's not his will, even though he will send blocks along the way, ultimately he will allow us to follow the path of our choosing and pay the consequences. Now, another important lesson I believe to be gained by that is Balaam's particular character was motivated by his love for personal financial gain. His willingness to compromise obedience to God for the sake of monetary reward when dangled in front of him is meant surely to serve as an obvious cautionary example for believers everywhere, highlighting the dangers of you prioritizing mental wealth over righteousness. And that's truly a lesson for the modern church, I think. It's a battle I fight with this all the time, since I gave up my job to do this, to simply try and avoid focusing on funding this and monetizing this. Rather, my whole focus, I desire most of the time to be just allow the content that I'm creating to be good so that people will be motivated to support me in this vision. Anyway, I think Balaam's story emphasizes the importance of obedience to God's commands. When individuals like him are seen to stay from the path of obedience that God has laid before us, they not only risk just simply going astray, but they risk also falling into what God considers unrighteousness, complete sinful actions, and in this case, out and out paganism and divination. So overall, I think this chapter is meant to serve as a reminder of the consequences of such obedience, framed within this idea that the thing that can lead so much of us astray is that of pursuing personal gain at the expense of righteousness. It's so important we try to remain steadfast in obedience to God's will and not be drawn in this way. The story of Balaam and this donkey is certainly a fascinating one because it teaches us about obedience, greed, but ultimately the sovereignty of God. It's helpful to know that the New Testament mentions Balaam several times, and when they do, they describe his greed and disobedience. We saw it in 2 Peter. Jude also warns against this. Balaam is used as an example of pursuing profit at the expense of obedience to God. And this story surely must remind us to avoid that error of Balaam, because it was an error where we saw greed leading to disobedience. We should instead prioritize obedience to God over personal gain in every situation. That's the crucial observation. Don't become fixated on money or personal gain. It is a path that leads you astray and away from obedience to God. And I think is the primary warning of the path of Balaam. Whether that's in your ministry or any other aspect of your life, don't go the path of Balaam, and you need to be vigilant and prioritize God over everything else, including the pursuit of profit. And I pray that we all can have the wisdom and the discernment to know where our priorities ultimately should lie and avoid this error of Balaam that we've seen today. I'm going to close the podcast there today. I'm not going to do the usual outro because I'm already late for an appointment where I'm speaking at a church in about half an hour, and I've got 15 minutes to get there and set up. So I'll say bye-bye for now, and I'll see you back here again very soon on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye now. Hey friends, hello, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I'm going to try and break one of my records this morning. This is the longest passage of scripture I've ever spoken on in one single session. Still planning for it to come in around half an hour, but with the Lord's help we'll get through it, because I'm actually going to cover from Numbers 22 to the end of chapter 24 and finish off this entire story of Balaam. Now, in this story, covering these chapters, we meet this guy who's rather generously described as a prophet, this guy Balaam. Balaam was approached by the king of Moab, you'll remember, to curse Israelite, and despite being warned by God not to do so, Balaam proceeds with his journey, but then he's instructed by the Lord only to speak what God tells him. And when Balaam arrives, the king of Moab takes him to a high place to observe the Israelites, and that's where we left it off last time. Now, thinking about the question this immediately raises in our minds, knowing the moral ambiguity of Balaam, well, I can't help but draw to attention to mind of situations where perhaps church ministers or pastors, even those who are incredibly effective in teaching the scriptures, people are saved by them, they're blessed by them, they grow in their understanding of the Word of God under their teachings, and then you find a situation where suddenly news surfaces of that individual's moral teachings. It might be financial mismanagement, it may be sexual infidelity, and this immediately prompts a flood of questions in the mind of those people who were pastored by him or who followed this person. How can someone be so apparently successful publicly in the ministry of the gospel, yet fail so spectacularly privately? And if people were genuinely ministered to by this person, how do we reconcile that with the hidden sins within their life? Can God still use disobedient individuals for his purpose? Now, this is a debate which is very widely going on in the Christian church today at the moment I'm recording this, both in the UK with a scandal of a church leader, incredibly effective ministry amongst young people, and as I record this, worldwide the sexual wrongdoings of a recently passed, very high-profile Christian evangelist and apologist are being discussed all over the internet. Now, I'm not going to get into the individual situations, I'm just going to try and address the wider perspective through what we're looking at today. And I do think, however, in bearing these scandals in mind, I think it's crucial to recognise that such situations are exceptions rather than the norm. Nevertheless, they're meant to prompt deep reflection amongst us. But I believe that Balaam's story offers insights here, because despite his flaws and his disobedience, God is definitely seen to communicate through him. Now, this doesn't excuse Balaam's actions or suggest God condones sins. Rather, it underscores God's sovereignty and his ability to work through flawed vessels to accompany his purposes. So when we're faced with similar dilemmas occurring in contemporary context, I believe we must keep at the forefront of our thinking several principles. First, that God's ways are higher than ours, and he has the right and the ability to use imperfect people for his purposes, because he can do that, and whilst at the same time not in any way negate the seriousness of personal sin. Secondly, the effectiveness of someone's ministry doesn't necessarily reflect their personal righteousness. Third, whilst God can use flawed individuals, he still calls us to pursue holiness and obedience if we're called into ministry or leadership, and we're meant to apply those principles in how we measure the effectiveness of a ministry. And finally, when confronted with moral failings, particularly those of leaders, we should respond, of course, as always, with grace, but at the same time accountability and a commitment to seek truth and justice for anyone who've been harmed by the actions of these persons. Ultimately, grappling with these questions, as in all things, requires humility, prayer, and a commitment to always seek God's wisdom and guidance. We must trust in His sovereignty and remain steadfast in our pursuit of righteousness, both personally and within our faith communities. Having said that, we're now going to drop in and see what Balaam's story, the rest of Balaam's story, can teach us about these things. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, record-breaking length of scriptures we're going to cover today, so I'll dive straight in, beginning in chapter 23, verse 1, where it tells us, Elam said, "Build me 7 altars here, and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams for me." Balak did as Balaam said, and the 2 of them offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to Balak, "Stay here beside your offering while I go aside, and perhaps the Lord will meet with me. Whatever he reveals to me, I will tell you." Then he went off to a barren height, and God met with him. And Balaam said, "I have prepared 7 altars, and on each altar I have offered a bull and a ram." The Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, "Go back to Balak and give him this word." So he went back to him and found him standing beside his offerings with all the Moabite officials. Then Balaam spoke his message. "Balak brought me for Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom God has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them, from the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart, and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number even 1/4 of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my final end be like theirs." Then Balak said to Balaam, "What have you done to me? I bought you to curse my enemies, but you've done nothing but bless them." He answered, "Must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth?" Now, that's an opening passage, but the whole thing we're going to cover today, Balaam's utterances, will actually span 2 chapters, and we'll see repeated attempts of Balak to try and get Balaam to curse Israel. It's essentially, I think, divided into 3 rounds of attempts, which I'll refer to as round 1, 2, and 3. And each round represents a dedicated attempt to coerce Balaam into cursing Israel. And after that, there's a period where the utterances of Balaam turn more from pronouncements to prophecies. Anyway, we've just read round 1, and we've saw that Balaam is summoned by Balak. He promised him a reward. He says if he curses Israel, but yet despite that, and Balaam, despite his pagan background, it seems to me most experts believe that he genuinely seeks the Lord's guidance in this. Surprisingly, from the beginning, you see, some might say surprisingly, eventually the Lord permitted Balaam to go to Balak. Remember that journey and the donkey we talked about last time? But in allowing it, he instructs him only to speak what he has put in his mouth. So despite Balaam's earliest disobedience, and of course his involvement in sorcery, the Lord is still choosing to use him with all his mixed motives as a vessel to convey his message. Now, what's fascinating is the fact that overall, you have to be honest and say Balaam is and certainly was an ungodly man. Yet he's allowed to meet with the Lord here. So this challenges our assumptions, I think, about who God can speak to and who God can use for his purposes. Sometimes God will speak to people in the midst of their most profound sins. Sometimes it's at that point is the only point at which he can offer them a road out. Anyway, I digress. In this situation, Balaam's primarily in this for the money. God still chooses to speak to him in spite of that. Balaam, upon seeing Israel, recognizes immediately their uniqueness among the nations. So despite Balak's insistence and pressure to curse them, Balaam simply expresses his desire to identify with Israel, even at the end suggesting that he might prefer to die with them rather than curse them. And he delivers the message God gave him, and in effect he refuses to speak anything other than what the Lord had commanded. Obviously, Balak, when he hears this, is displeased with Balaam, particularly the fact that he's literally blessing Israel. He, of course, was asking and expecting him to curse him. But Balaam maintains his obedience to the Lord's command, emphasizing again that he can only speak what God puts in his mouth. So, in essence, this passage plays out for us and highlights the tension between Balak's desire to get Balaam to curse Israel, and yet still we see God's sovereignty over this situation. And despite even his use of sorcery and Balaam's initial disobedience and his motivation for even going to meet Balak, God ultimately ensures that his will prevails on all this. So that's the opening part of the narrative. And I think what it teaches is us as a principle that God can use even the most unlikely people for his purposes. It reminds us of his sovereignty in all these types of situations, even when it involves human disobedience at the center of it. It underscores the reality of God's commands being revealed regardless of the personal desires, motivations, or potentially even obedience to those people that he might use. So I think as you reflect on this, the big lesson is we have to learn to trust in God's sovereignty and obey his commands and remain open to being used by him, and being open to when he uses people in unexpected ways, or even unexpected people, just as he's using Balaam here. Everyone must ultimately be willing to be vessels for God's word and his glory. That was round 1. Round 2 begins in verse 13. Balaam's second message. Then Balak said, "Come with me to another place where you can see them, and you will not see them all, but only the outskirts of their camp. And from there curse them for me." So he took him to the field of Zophim on top of Pisgah, and there he built 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Balaam said to Balak, "Stay here beside your offerings while I meet with him over there." The Lord met with Balaam and again put a word in his mouth and said, "Go back to Balak and give him this word." So he went to him and found him standing beside his offerings with the Moabite officials, and Balak asked him, "What did the Lord say?" Then he spoke this message. "Arise, Balak, and listen. Hear me, son of Zippor. God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he not speak and then not act? Does he promise and then not fulfill? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot change it. No misfortune is seen in Jacob, no misery observed in Israel. The Lord their God is with them. The shout of the king is among them. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. There is no divination against Jacob, no evil omens against Israel. It will now be said of Jacob and of Israel, 'See what God has done.' The people rise like a lioness, and they rouse themselves like a lion that does not rest till it devours its prey and drinks the blood of its victims." Then Balak said to Balaam, "Neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all." Balaam answered, "Did I not tell you I must do whatever the Lord says?" Okay. This time Balaam and Balak proceed to a different mountain spot. likely a range in the northeast corner of the Dead Sea. Some suggest this time the events are occurring on Mount Nebo. Anyway, in verse 15, we see Balaam meet with the Lord, who once again puts his word in his mouth and instructs him to return to Balak and to speak only what he has said. And as Balaam stands by the burnt offerings with Balak and all these princes and leaders of the Moabite, of course, Balak, upon his return, eagerly asks him what the Lord has told him. And then Balaam delivers his second oracle, as some describe it, emphasizing the unchanging nature of God and his blessing. In fact, in verse 19, he reminds him, God is not a man. Should he lie? Is he like the Son of Man that he tells lies and needs to repent? So this underscores the certainty of God's word and the fact that there is a continuity there, a faithfulness in him fulfilling his promises. And in verse 20, Balaam affirms that he has received the command to bless Israel, not to curse him, and he can't reverse that. Despite any observed, even mistakes or iniquities, or even the wickedness of Israel, God will still choose to bless them, and no human endeavor can ever alter that purpose. And that's what he communicates to Balak. Balaam continues to assure Balak that no form of sorcery, no attempts at divination will ever thwart God's blessing upon Israel. And he speaks of Israel using this metaphor of being like a lion rising up and devouring its prey. The imagery is meant to convey Israel's victorious nature under God's protection. Balak, not surprisingly, is becoming increasingly frustrated. He implores Balaam and actually says, well, if you can't curse them, then stop at least reiterating all these blessings about them. And Balaam, in response, reminds of his commitment to speak only what the Lord has commanded him to say. And he reminds him that he said that from the outset. So, in essence, Balaam's message back to Balak is clear. God's purpose for Israel is not only unchanging, but it is unstoppable. And despite any futile attempts by anyone to try and curse them by any means, God, as a reality, has chosen to bless them, and his words and his promise hold fast and will prevail. Okay, so what can we learn from this exchange between Balaam and Balak? Well, simply it reminds us again of the sovereignty of God and the certainty of his will and his purposes coming to pass. No human endeavor, no manipulation, not even manipulations by the enemy, can thwart God's plans. His word stands firm and his promises are sure, and we can rely on them to this day. All right, that was round 2. Now round 3 begins in verse 27, and Balaam's pronouncements after this are going to come thick and fast. Balaam's third message, verse 27 to 30. Then Balak said to Balaam, come, let me take you to another place. Perhaps it will please God to let you curse them for me from there. And Balak took Balaam to the top of Peor and overlooked the wasteland. Balaam said, build me 7 altars here and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams for me. And Balaam did as Balak had said and offered a ram and a bull on each altar. We'll just pause there. Balaam's already had 2 failed attempts to curse Israel. Perhaps he's finally grasping the reality and helping Balak grasp the reality that it ultimately pleases the Lord to bless Israel, and he won't allow anything else. And in chapter 4, in the coming chapter 4, verse 1, we're going to see a shift in Balaam's approach. He's no longer going to seek sorcery or engage with these pagan rituals that we've seen up to this point. There's coming a time when he understands that God's intention is to bless Israel, and he finally aligns himself, if you like, with God's purposes, and the oracles switch from being attempts to curse to actually giving utterances to messianic prophecies. Now, to get back to where we are, the repetition of the events are beginning to sound familiar to us, aren't they? Despite Balak's persistence in him attempting to get Balaam to curse Israel, each effort is met with God's determination that his people, and Balaam's growing acknowledgement of God's favor towards Israel, initially just mouthing it, but now beginning to imbibe it, serves as a reminder of God's sovereignty and his unwavering commitment to his chosen people. Now, we tend to focus that when people are using flawed people on their fall, but of course God can also take flawed people and bring them into alignment with his will, which I think is kind of what's going on here. The big thing I'm saying is it's important to recognize the connection between all these stories of Balaam, beginning in chapter 2 all the way through chapter 23 and 24. They are meant to form a single cohesive narrative about the journey in this guy's life and to reveal God's plan and Balaam's, I believe, evolving, if you like, understanding of it. Without taking that helicopter view over all of these chapters, I think it's really hard to grasp the significance of this amazing journey Balaam's on and God's purposes across the wider picture. In fact, I actually think we need all of the Bible to get a full understanding of the journey that Balaam went on, and the fact that perhaps, although it had its high points, overall it didn't end that well for him. Anyway, let's pick up in chapter 24, and it says, "Now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel," so you can see there's a recognition here, "he did not resort to divination at any other times, but turned his face towards the Israel. When Balaam looked out and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came upon him, and he spoke his message." This is the prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eyes see clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate, and whose eyes are open. "How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Like valleys they spread out like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from their buckets, their seed will have abundant water. Their king will be greater than Agag, their kingdom will be exalted. God brought them out of Egypt, and they have the strength of a wild ox. They devour hostile nations and break their bones in pieces. With their arrows they pierce them. Like a lion they crouch and lie down, like a lioness who dares to rouse them. May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed." It then continues with the narrative. "Then Balak's anger burned against Balaam. He struck his hands together and said to him, 'I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them now 3 times. Now leave at once and go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded.' And Balaam answered Balak, 'Did I not tell you the messengers you sent? Even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything of my own accord, good or bad, to go beyond the command of the Lord, and I must only say what the Lord says. Now I am going back to my people, but come, let me warn you of what this people will do to your people in the days to come." Okay, we'll pick that up in a minute, but just pausing there at this point, we saw in the opening verses of chapter 4 what I believe is a significant transformation in Balaam's disposition towards God. It actually tells us the Spirit of God descends upon him, indicating that he has the divine presence with him, and that's the point that leads him at this point to completely abandon sorcery. The moment, I believe, marks a pivotal shift in Balaam's understanding and his alignment with God's will. Despite his past involvement in all sorts of stuff, Balaam is seen to have an encounter here with the Spirit of God, and it demonstrates that at this point he clearly has a genuine connection with the Lord. So it raises the question in some people's mind whether Balaam at this point truly knows the Lord in the way we would understand a believer today. His response to the Spirit's presence certainly suggests at least a deepening spiritual awareness and his receptivity to receiving and repeating divine guidance. So what we see here is described as Balaam's prophecy in verses 3 to 9, and his words reflect an understanding, a deep understanding of God's plan for Israel. He speaks of Israel's blessedness and their prosperity, likening them to flourishing gardens and majestic trees, didn't he? The imagery also portrays the abundance and strength that God bestows upon his chosen people. And then in verse 7, he foretold the rise of a king from Israel, symbolizing their future leadership and authority and how the world will be blessed through them. This king is described as exalted and powerful, signifying Israel's sovereignty under God's divine rule. He also emphasizes God's protection and blessing upon them, declaring this phrase that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And this affirmation underscores God's unwavering commitment to his covenant with Israel and his determination to preserve and prosper his chosen nation. Moreover, Balaam is reiterating here, you probably know that it's a familiar phrase, this is the promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where he too affirmed that God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse them. So the divine principle that Balaam is uttering is rooted in God's covenant with Abraham and how it extends to all generations right up to this point in the confrontation with Balak, and ongoing, and remains relevant, I would say, even today. Balak's reaction to Balaam's prophecy reflects his absolute frustration and his disappointment about how this has all worked out. Despite his repeated attempts to manipulate Balaam into cursing Israel, he's only receiving back blessings in return. Balak's sense of anger is almost palatable. It seeps off the page, doesn't it, as he accuses Balaam of actually betraying his promise and denies him the reward, the money that he'd promised him in the first place. But in response, Balaam reminds him of his commitment to only speak what the Lord had told him to say, and he reminds them that he was upfront about the fact that would be unable to act contrary in God's will. He told that to the men he sent, the first men and the second men, and he reminded them even when he was offered great riches to do otherwise. So Balaam's integrity and his obedience at this point to God's word, I think, are evident here. Through his interactions with Balak, the fact that he remained true to what God was saying, despite the pressure and the temptation to act otherwise. But as Balaam prepares to depart, he speaks again, and he offers some final warning to Balak's prophecies foretelling the fate of even his own people at the hands of Israel, and these are meant to serve not only for that day, but I believe because they're messianic prophecies of not only the return of the Messiah, but the consequences of opposing God's people, emphasizing the inevitability of God bringing about his plan. So let's look at these. Balaam's fourth message. Then he spoke his message, the prophecy of Balaam son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eyes see clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the word of God and whose knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty and who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of all the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, her enemy, will be conquered, but Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. Now, the next prophecies follow thick and fast. His fifth, his sixth, and his seventh message. His fifth message says, Then Balak saw Amalek and spoke his messages. Amalek was first among the nations, but their end will be utter destruction. Balaam's sixth prophecy. Then he saw the Kenites and spoke his message. Your dwelling place is secure. Your nest is set on a rock, yet you Kenites will be destroyed when Asshur takes you captive. And then his seventh message, closing off this chapter, then he spoke his messages, Alas, who can live when God does this? Ships will come from the shores of Cyprus. They will subdue Ashur and Eber, but they too will come to ruin. Then Balak got up and returned home, and Balak went his own way also. So all of a sudden here, we have Balaam giving prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. These are what are called messianic prophecies. Even Jews today recognize this. This is not, friends, just a Christian interpretation of these words. These are messianic prophecies recognized throughout Jewish history as being so. Let me explain. Balaam's prophecies here in Numbers 24, particularly the first one, 17 to 19, contains the specific messianic elements that were foretold as foretelling the coming, the rising of this royal figure who will hold dominion and authority. The image of the scepter and the star are there to signify kingship, and Jewish interpretations from then until this day have always acknowledged this passage as that of being a messianic prophecy. In fact, the reference to a scepter symbolizes the royal power and authority, indicating that this king will arise from within the house of Jacob, aligning with Jacob's prophecy at the end of Genesis in chapter 49, where he predicts that this future ruler will emerge from the tribe of Judah. Balaam's prophecy here therefore extends beyond the immediate historical figures that it's dealing with, or even the soon-to-rise figures like Saul and David in the history of Israel. They're pointing not only forward towards that, but also towards the ultimate fulfillment in the appearance of a Messiah. Jewish writing from the first century have interpreted this passage this way as referring to the ultimate return of a Messiah. Furthermore, in the shorter prophecies that followed at the end of the chapter, Balaam includes references to the conquest of Edom, Moab, nations that had historical significance for Israel, prophesying the eventual downfall of these nations as described here. All meant to serve as a reminder of God's sovereignty over all nations and his judgment upon those who oppose his purposes. Now, of course, some aspects of Balaam's prophecy have found their historical fulfillment. Particularly, we see it played out in the conquest of Edom and Moab that is to come. But its ultimate fulfillment lies in the Messianic age, the coming of Jesus Christ, the King of Israel, representing the culmination of God's redemptive plan, bringing about victory and salvation for all God's people. Balaam's prophecies in these closing verses of Numbers 24 highlight and embed the messianic hope that will be continued to be echoed throughout the Old Testament scriptures, always pointing forward to its ultimate fulfillment in the return of Jesus Christ. It underscores the centrality of God's plan throughout history and the centrality of using Jesus the Messiah in God's purposes to save his people. Now, Balaam's story is complex, his utterances are complex, the whole thing is multifaceted. Despite his disobedience, despite his involvement in sorcery, God still chose to use him as a mouthpiece to deliver the big picture, his purposes for his people. But I do have to say that even the Bible itself would show that this is not the norm throughout the Bible. This is not the way God typically uses people. In fact, you would say typically God judges sin and he judges it promptly. But Balaam's case stands as an exception in order, I believe, to teach a principle rather than as a rule. Secondly, it's absolutely essential to recognize that throughout of this, God did not at any time be seen to condone Balaam's actions, particularly his early ones, where we actually see he chose to oppose it and actually thwart them. There's also evidence in the condemnation of Balaam's actions and his motives in other parts of the Bible, particularly in the New Testament in 2 Peter and Jude, where his behavior is roundly denounced. Additionally, Balaam's eternal fate, as depicted in Revelation, further underscores God's disapproval of his actions. And finally, whilst God used Balaam's mouth, if you like, to deliver his message, it's crucial to understand that God did not endorse any of these acts of disobedience. Instead, what we see is God working against and working through Balaam despite his flaws, emphasizing his ability and his sovereignty even to use imperfect vessels to accomplish his purposes. This for me highlights the complexity of who we are as human beings, our human nature, the way in which God's plans can still unfold even amidst using people like you and I, disobedient people, people with moral ambiguities in their life, people sometimes even using his word for their own selfish ends. The principle is that God can use even the most challenging situations, even the actions of those with impure motives, to accomplish his plans and reveal them to the wider world. Just as God here used Balaam's words from his mouth to deliver his message, it's crucial to emphasize that it's not the norm. God never endorses disobedience or rewards impure motives. Instead, he sovereignly works through imperfect vessels in order to achieve his purposes, which is why ultimately he's able to use people like you and me, friends. The key takeaway here of this lengthy, detailed, intricate, complex, challenging passage today is that God's word and his gospel are powerful. They're so powerful that they can in fact use any means to bring about his will, even in the midst of adversity or fallen human nature. Thanks for being with me today. Hello, my lovely friends. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I have entitled today's little talk, How Bad Can Things Really Get? The passage we're going to look at is Numbers 25, the whole chapter, verses 1 to 18. Now, it's often said that when you think things can't get any worse, they often do. This can happen in our personal life, where we can see one thing break down after another, but I also believe it can occur in society as a whole. Morally, we may feel today like we're reaching new lows, wondering just how bad things truly can get. Even if we look back over just the last 20 years or so, we can see how rapidly things have degenerated from a societal point of view. Now, it's confusing and it's upsetting. But just how much worse can things get? Well, today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whenever you're listening to this, the plan is we're going to explore together this theme as we continue our examination in the closing out of the story of Balaam. This was the guy who was asked to curse Israel, but never did. At least not as far as the passages we've explored thus far. But in Numbers chapter 25, we witness a troubling turn of events. The Moabites, terrified of the Israelites, you'll remember, they'd attempted to, first of all, to use Balaam to curse them, but now we see them take a different strategy. They attempt to seduce Israel into idolatry and adultery. Now, although Balaam isn't mentioned in this chapter, later in the book it's confirmed that he plays a role in initiating these events. He's there behind the scenes. So the story of Balaam isn't quite over yet, or certainly the consequences of his actions aren't, and what we're about to see transpires out of that, we'll discover today. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, you're very welcome. Now, it's not such a long chapter today that we're going to have to break it down. What I plan to do is read for you the whole chapter so that you sort of get a sense of the narrative sweep, and then we'll go back and look at it in a couple of bite-sized chunks. In my Bible, this passage is given the title, Moab Seduces Israel, which is quite fitting actually. So let me read the whole chapter for you. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making a covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites." The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family. The Lord then said to Moses, "Treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them. For they treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the Peor incident involving their sister Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite leader, the woman who was killed when the plague came as a result of that incident." Now, you should immediately note, I'm sure you noticed as I read through that Balaam's name isn't mentioned in this chapter, but we learn in Numbers 31 verse 6 later on that he is in fact responsible for the corruption described here. Let me read that verse for you. "They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incidents, so that a plague struck the Lord's people." So we know now that Balaam is here. He's behind the scenes. Despite all of Balak's efforts initially to induce Balaam to curse Israel, he ultimately succeeded in persuading him to corrupt them, if you like, by more subtle means. This paints the picture for us where we need to be aware that sometimes Satan, when he doesn't succeed with a direct attack, he will often opt for an indirect one, simply by leading people into sin, thereby prompting God's judgment. Okay, so let's dive deep into the passage itself. The first 6 verses or so, initially we find Israel encamped in the acacia grove, and it is while camped there we see the people begin to engage in what is described as harlotry with the women of Moab. Now these women invite the Israelites to sacrifice to their gods, and the people, well, they go along with it. They do that and they bow down before their gods, in fact it tells us. And as a result of that, we see Israel becoming entangled with what are described as the Baal of Peor. Now this, of course, provokes the anger of God. Moses is then told by God, he's instructed, in fact, to take all the leaders of the people, the ones who've been involved in this activity, kill the offenders before the Lord. By doing that, that will turn away God's fierce anger against Israel because of what has been going on. So following this command, Moses instructs the judges, the leaders, to execute those among their groups who had become entwined, joined up to these practices relating to Baal at Peor. So this initial section of the chapter serves to highlight for us the idolatry and the depth of the idolatry that Israel was engaged in, and it sets the stage for the unfolding events that follow, but also, I would suggest, should prompt us today to reflect on the consequences of a nation turning away from God. These first verses also provide us with the context by indicating the location of the Israelites. They're situated in that place where they were based, the Acacia Grove, which was and is their final stop before they would eventually enter Israel. The thing to note is that all of this began with sexual relationships between the Israelite men with the women of Moab, suggesting that there is prostitution involved in this by use of the term harlotry. Now, in the preceding chapters, it was Balak, the king of Moab, who sought to have them cursed by Balaam. However, we now learn that the entanglement of Israel is actually being caused and achieved by the women of Moab, who are seen to entice the men of Israel into committing what is described as harlotry with them, and it is that act that brings the curse upon them. Now, this act of harlotry, as it is described, is because, as this and other passages later explain, it is sexual activity, prostitution, was intertwined with the worship of Baal. At that time in the ancient world, prostitution was part of Baal worship. So this is not just ordinary sexual immorality, of course that would be bad enough. It's a form of occult idol worship which involved sex with people during those religious rituals. It's going to be further elaborated for us in subsequent verses and passages. But in the opening verses, we see simply that the women of Moab invite the Israelites to come, mix with them, and sacrifice to their gods. And the Hebrew text experts say that it particularly emphasizes the role of the woman involved in leading the Israelites astray. And the Israelites are depicted, aren't they, as literally bowing down to the gods of the Moabites. And by the way, this is corroborated for us in the Psalms, in Psalms like 106. These events are described there as well. Additionally, it's important to note is that it says they partook in sacrifices offered to the dead. So that's another layer of occult depravity added to their actions in all this. Awful, isn't it? But these practices are not unique to the Moabites. They were prevalent among many nations that surrounded Israel at that time. Idolatry, ritualized worship practices were often coupled with prostitution. It was a very common phenomenon in the ancient world. And here we see Israel becoming joined to Baal, not surprisingly provoking the absolute anger burning of the Lord against such practices. So in response to this grievous sin, the Lord instructs Moses that they have to take the leaders of the people who were involved in this type of Baal worship and literally kill them in broad daylight. Now, this is a drastic measure, but it is, of course, meant to serve as a stark warning, saying the seriousness of this situation. And the judges of Israelites, they carry out the command, and they are seen to repent and weep before the temple proper after that. This is all underscoring the severity of the situation they're trying to deal with. This narrative, this story, is really significant in the history of Israel. In fact, it's referenced in several other biblical passages, including Deuteronomy 4, the Psalms, including very much so in Psalm 106, Hosea 9, and it's even referenced in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Having said all that, it kind of surprises me how little this passage is known compared to other Old Testament stories that aren't referenced nearly as much. However, what we need to note then is that these events hold profound significance in the collective memory of Israel. Now, I started out by noting that sometimes when you think things can't get worse, they do so. So what could be worse than committing adultery and idolatry? Well, we need to brace ourselves, friends, because it does indeed get worse. The first part of the passage discusses idolatry, whilst the second part of the passage focuses on the indecency of one particular man among the Israelites. Numbers 27, 6-18. The second half, beginning in verse 6, deals with this. Here we see introduced to us a scene where the Israelites, as I said, are mourning over these events at the entrance to the tabernacle. And amid this somber, repentant atmosphere, one Israelite, later identified as Zimri, boldly brings a Midianite woman named Cosbi into the camp. He literally parades her past Moses and the grieving congregation and takes her into the tent. This act of open defiance, open immorality, escalates the situation further. However, there's a response to this flagrant violation. Phinehas, a grandson of Aaron, takes decisive action. He actually enters the tent after them with a javelin in his hand and kills both the man and the woman, thereby immediately putting an end to their sin. Now, this act is not meant to be considered as murder. It's rather a form, perhaps the first time we see it, enacted in a personal way for personal sin, a form of capital punishment. Their actions were deemed to warrant such immediate and severe consequences. As a result of this incident and the fact that such uncleanliness entered the area of the Holy of Holies, the Lord, in response, sends a plague among the people, and immediately we find out that 24,000 perish. Now, I have to note there appears to be a discrepancy between the number given here and that mentioned in that passage in 1 Corinthians 10 I talked about earlier, where it states that 23,000 died. So how do we address the discrepancy? Well, there isn't really one there. If we examine 1 Corinthians 10 closely, we'll notice that Paul mentions that 23,000 were killed on that one day. Numbers actually doesn't specify the time period, and it says 24,000 people die in the plague overall. So it seems reasonable to me to assume that on that day of this action, 23,000 people died. Then Phinehas acted and the plague was ended, but some remaining sick people perhaps died afterwards, maybe simply died after midnight on the same day. Thus, I don't believe that this supposed discrepancy is in any way a contradiction. Rather, it's just a complementary account of the same events from a slightly different perspective with a slightly different time frame. Anyway, I digress. What the important thing here is, in this dire situation where sin, profound sin, enters among the heart of the people, one man is seen to stand up for the righteousness of God. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron, displays fervent devotion to the Lord and his cause, and his desire for the people to remain cleansed from sin. Because of his fervor, the Lord is seen to spare the Israelites from any further devastation of the plague that had come upon them. And consequently, we see in these verses that the Lord, in fact, rewards Phinehas with a covenant of peace, as it's described, offering him and his family a perpetual priesthood through his descendants. This remarkable act of zeal, of standing up for God amid the moral decay and the willful attack on God's people, highlights for us Phinehas's, well, almost exemplary character in responding to this. Now, in the text, it actually confirms the identity of the offenders in some detail. It mentions that Zimri is from the tribe of Simeon, and Cosbi was a Midianite woman, but both had positions and came from families of some importance and authority. And I think this detail is added simply to underscore the significance of the depth of how much these tribes, the children of Israel and the Midianites, had been, well, the significance of how much they'd become entwined with each other, how much they'd implicated themselves amongst the Israelite society. And this, I suppose, is meant to be a reminder and underlying of the importance of community accountability and cohesiveness, especially when it comes to times of moral crisis. Now, as we continue into the book of Numbers, very soon we're going to encounter another census, emphasizing the ongoing significance of numbering and organizing and setting apart the people of Israel. These numerical records will not only reflect the organization of the nation, but will also convey spiritual truths about the moral position of that ongoing community historically. Significantly, when we examine the numbers for the tribe of Simeon, which will be revealed in a couple of chapters, we'll find out that at the first census they numbered 59,300, but then later on in chapter 26, verse 14, it specifically points out for this that their count has decreased to 22,200. The notable reduction could be attributed to their prominent involvement in the sinful incident that's described in this chapter, and the fact that the plague fell mainly upon that tribe. And then in the final part of this story, we encounter the Lord's response to these sinful actions, how he sets in place what he needs to do in the longer term. In verse 16, the Lord instructs Moses to take action against the Midianites, those who were complicit in seducing the Israelites. Because they were so complicit in seducing the Israelites into idolatry and adultery. And God then says to Moses that he must treat the Midianites as enemies from here on in, implying an ongoing hostility, almost a state of war against them, again underlining and indicating the severity of this situation. Now, it's essential to note that the progression of events involving the Moabites, the Midianites, and the Israelites ultimately is one that leads to the judgment of the Lord falling. So the Lord then, even when atonement has been made, the Lord concludes by highlighting ongoingly the consequences of Israel's disobedience and the Lord's determination to hold them accountable into the future, and the Midianites as also as coming under a state of war, set in conflict thereafter against the children of Israel. Now, reflecting on this passage, I think we can draw obviously parallels to the broader ongoing history of Israel. Just as they'd experienced significant blessings in the past, followed by huge failures, this episode illustrates that similar familiar pattern of continuing to do this sort of thing again and again. If we go back to the beginning, the juxtaposition of receiving the Mosaic law almost followed immediately by them committing adultery and worshipping the golden calf, underscores the fickleness not just of this nation of Israel, but also, I would suggest, fallen human nature in general. It shows the propensity for disobedience and how it will often follow on even after periods of divine favor. And then we see the depth of it played out in the actions of individuals like Zimri and this woman Cosbi, meant to serve as stark reminders to the depths to which human depravity can descend. He reached the point where he and this woman had such brazen defiance and contempt for God's covenant, God's salvation plan for humanity, that he brought her up to before the Holy of Holies. That shows the danger of just how far pride, rebellion can lead people to fall. In contemporary times, the warning from the book of 1 John for us as Christian believers to keep ourselves from idols remains absolutely relevant still today. As materialism and other forms of idolatry continue to pervade every aspect of society, these passages are meant to warn us against this sort of spiritual waywardness. They're meant to resonate deeply, not just down through the history of Israel, but also for us today. Now, indeed, as we stand today and as we witness the very clear, obvious moral decline of our nations and individual people around us, we're compelled, after reading this passage, to ponder the sobering question, yet things have got bad, but how much worse than they can get. Now, I preached on this passage way back in 2006, and I looked at my notes in preparation for this today, and I noticed some of the things I could see happening in the UK and some of the things that I believe might happen in the near future. It's interesting to me what I said there. I referenced the fact that same-sex marriage was very soon going to become legal in the UK. And I pointed out that I believe that someday people will use the argument that was used to support same-sex marriage, they would apply it to polygamous unions. I also suggested that prostitution, for the most part illegal in the UK and around the world, I believed would be widely legalized, and in fact it would become the normalization of prostitution and could in fact become a reality in the future, where it's seen as almost a viable career option. There's the rising trend in our universities of particularly young women, mainly because that's where the opportunity exists. I'm sure men would do the same if they could, but young people, to a greater percent, as maybe as somewhere between 5 and 10%, are using a form of prostitution to fund their education by taking advantage of websites like OnlyFans. The widespread acceptance and normalization of prostitution, I speculated in 2006, might become a reality in the future. Also, the undermining of the sanctity of life at both ends of the scale, in the rapid proliferation of abortion and the lessening of the rules and the guidelines around it, coupled with the exploitation of the disabled and the mentally ill and the elderly by assisted suicide becoming more widely accepted. Those were just the things that I could foresee in 2006. Sadly, it seemed I was correct in my predictions. Anyway, so that's where we are today. That's where we're going today. But drawing parallels to this ancient biblical narrative, we find a similar pattern of moral decay emerging here. A laissez-faire attitude to individual righteousness and not recognizing in any way its effect on the wider community. Here it emerged in the same way as it always does, immorality leading to idolatry. And in this story of Israel's sin and judgment, thankfully there emerges an individual, a single man in this passage, who exemplifies this zeal for the Lord amidst this moral degradation, degeneration that is happening all around him. So even today in our contemporary societies, even within our Christian communities, we're clearly more likely to see instances of moral compromise and wrongdoing than we ever have before. Yet amid this darkness, there remains the hope exemplified in Psalm 1199 that reminds us that if we cleanse our ways by aligning ourselves with God's word, then we can be brought back into a state of grace. Just as one individual's passion for the Lord here stood out in this narrative, I believe today individual believers who stand firm in their faith amidst societal decay around them can have a profound influence on holding back the tide, so to speak. So in conclusion, when looking at this passage from the perspective of how and where we live today, the trajectory of societal morality may seem bleak indeed. Yet there is still hope, this passage tells me. There is still hope that in our individual commitment to righteousness and love of the God, we too can not only be protected for it, but can help stem the rising tide. Friend, this passage tells me that we are called to navigate through a world that is increasingly at odds with the biblical principles, yet still, as the psalmist wrote, we may too be like David. As Moses wrote, we may too be like Phinehas and remain people who are after God's own heart. I hope our examination of this passage enables you to do that and live this way. Thanks for joining me today. That's it, friends. Fantastic to be with you today. Thank you for joining me. Please subscribe if you're not doing so already, and join me on this journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You're able to listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, but by subscribing, you won't miss another episode. You should get a notification every time one's dropped in the future. The normal pattern is new podcasts every day, Monday to Friday, with occasional bonus episodes at the weekend. We're working through the entire Bible, alternate books, Old and New Testament, so when we finish off the book of Numbers, we'll be going into the Gospel of John, probably in about a week or two's time. So stick with me, friends, and let's try and complete this project together. Can I remind you that this podcast is hosted on the bibleproject.buzzsprout.com, and there you'll find ways in which you can connect to me. You can send me a text through that host website, and you'll find links to all the places where I put the additional free resources. Places like the social networks, YouTube, my LinkedIn page, all those places. And you'll find things like episode notes, as well as a full transcript of everything I've said today and every day. You'll also find a link there to the Patreon community, where you can decide to connect with this ministry on a more meaningful level. You can reach out and speak to me there. You can even support it if you want financially, although you don't have to do that to be part of the Patreon community. And that's the place where I put loads and loads of hours, in fact, over 50 hours at the minute, of bonus material. Stuff relating to the teaching and the evangelist type work I'm doing in secular environments in the midweek. You'll find places there, it clearly doesn't fit within the Bible Project podcast series, but stuff I do where I go into wholly secular environments and try to address an issue that's of interest to the people there, but try and bring a Christian or a biblical perspective to it. Or I just share my response afterwards, or my preparation notes before I go into those environments. It's a real chance to peek behind the curtain and see what I'm doing in my everyday life. And I do hope you find it helpful, because I am addressing issues of psychology, what the world thinks philosophically, even in relation to the arts and artificial intelligence. There's all that sort of stuff going on over there. So why not take a look? It's all available on the Patreon community. And with that said, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for being with me. I do hope you'll be back here again tomorrow. Oh, by the way, I also have a History of the Church podcast, which you can join over there. I call it the History of the Church because I'm placed it on the History Network as a way of podcast networks, as a way of attracting people who aren't believers to listen to perhaps to the history of the church. But between you and me, friends, it's really a history of the Holy Spirit working through the hearts and minds of all the major figures in church history. With that said, I'll say bye-bye for now, and I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye now.